Hello lovelies, in this video we're going to be bringing through adrenal gland structure and function, all the different jobs that it does for your A-level biology.
The endocrine system. The endocrine system uses hormones released into the blood in order to communicate and control the body. It's made up of organs called glands, which are groups of cells that are directly associated with capillaries, and they don't have any ducts, so they're not attached to kind of tubes or vessels that would carry substances to another organ. They secrete their substances straight into the bloodstream. Target cells for the hormones that they secrete can be found all over the body, and they will have receptors that are complementary to those hormone molecules, and that's how the hormones can cause changes in the body to occur in different organs in different places once they've travelled around in the bloodstream. The cortex secretes steroid hormones, for example cortisol and aldosterone. These are responsible for short and long-term effects that help to respond to stress. They suppress your immune system, increase your blood volume and pressure, start the breakdown of proteins and fats into glucose. This increases the amount of energy that's available to the body for the flight or fight response. So there are actually 3 layers of cells within the cortex. The zona glomerulosa, or the outer layer, this secretes the mineralocorticoids. So aldosterone is an example of a mineralocorticoid, and these help to control the concentration of sodium and potassium ions in the blood. So this is how this can have an impact on things like blood volume and blood pressure, and that is one of the main kind of control systems used by these types of hormones secreted from this part of the cortex. The zona fasciculata, or the middle of these 3 layers of cells, this secretes the glucocorticoids. So these are going to be the hormones that are responsible for the breakdown of proteins, fats and glucose in order to increase energy. This kind of makes sense if you think about like glucose, and it helps to control these levels in the body. So cortisol is an example of a glucocorticoid. We know that cortisol is directly related to stress levels, and you can actually measure cortisol production and cortisol levels in the blood to kind of identify different periods of stress, and when you're stressed it's normally raised, and so it's part of this short and long-term response to stress. So your stress response plays a role in your immune system suppression as well, which is often why when you are stressed and overworked you can get sick more easily, and so that is also linked to the behaviour of these hormones. And then lastly, the inner layer, the zona reticularis, this produces the molecules that are precursors to the sex hormones. So they travel around into the organs such as the ovaries and the testes, and they kind of are precursors to estrogen, progesterone, testosterone. So these are what we call androgens. So we're going to look at the action of the steroid hormones. The way that steroid and protein hormones work is different, so we're going to look at each one in turn. So steroid hormones can pass through the cell membrane because they are made of lipids, and so they are able to pass through the membrane without any issues. They enter through the cell membrane and then they bind to a specific receptor in the cytoplasm. This complex of the steroid hormone and the receptor can then move into the nucleus and actually bind to the DNA. It binds to a receptor on the DNA and it acts as what we call a transcription factor. So it allows the stimulation of transcription to occur. So it allows RNA polymerase to bind, and that's going to produce mRNA from that piece of DNA, which will then obviously leave the nucleus and then be translated at a ribosome into a protein. And it will be the protein that is produced that will then cause those changes to happen in the cell. So steroid hormones enter through the cell membrane and they have a direct effect on the expression of DNA in the cell. Adrenal gland structure. The adrenal glands have an outer layer called the cortex and an inner layer called the medulla. The medulla secretes catecholamine hormones. These are protein-like hormones that include adrenaline and noradrenaline. They affect short-term stress responses. They help to increase the heart and breathing rate, divert blood to brain and muscles, and start the process of glycogen breakdown. The actions of adrenaline are widespread, as many cells have adrenaline receptors. The main role of releasing adrenaline is to prepare the body for activity. Now, often we talk about this being kind of the fight or flight response, but obviously it doesn't just happen when you're scared or stressed. It can happen when you're going to do kind of exercise, or if you are anxious or kind of excited as well for something. So there's lots of reasons and triggers for why adrenaline is released, but all of the actions that it takes in the body are going to be to help the body to prepare for activity, movement, processing things, being ready to kind of go. So it relaxes the smooth muscle in the bronchioles. So this obviously widens airways, which means that you can get more air in, so therefore more oxygen in when you're breathing, which will obviously help have more oxygen in your blood, which is good because we can then carry out more respiration. Again, to help, it increases your stroke volume and your heart rate, which means more blood is going to be pumped faster around the body. Vasoconstriction, so the actual constriction of the blood vessels helps to increase blood pressure, which again means that the pushing of the blood is going to be happening at a greater force, so it's going around the body faster. Dilates your pupils so that you can get more light into your eyes so you can see more clearly. Converts glycogen to glucose, so we're breaking down our glycogen stores to release more glucose into the blood, again, so that we can carry out more respiration. It raises hairs on the skin. Now, this is something that's kind of left over from when we were like covered in a lot more hair, and you'll see it in things like cats and other mammals when they are kind of stressed or scared. They kind of puff up and they have all these kind of the big hair that kind of pushes out to kind of make themselves look bigger, look more intimidating. It obviously doesn't have that effect on us, but obviously when people say they get goosebumps, where they get that feeling where the hairs on their arms or the back of the neck stand up, that's that feeling, and that's come from this adrenaline response. It reduces the digestive system activity because we don't need to be digesting at a time when we want to be running or fighting or doing whatever it is we're doing. And that sometimes can give you that butterfly sick feeling because the blood literally is like moving and being diverted away from your stomach and digestive system. So that's when you get that kind of sick butterfly feeling before doing something that you're a bit nervous about. And then lastly, it increases your mental awareness. So we know this is something that can help in things like exams and things like that. So the adrenaline coursing through your body when you're in an exam or a test or even like performing can really help sort of boost your mental awareness and your mental activity. And it might be better than it would be normally. Okay, so we've looked at how the hormones that we've talked about, so insulin and glucagon so far, how they bring about change in blood glucose. But we haven't actually gone into detail about how they actually cause those changes to happen in the cell. And I mentioned in the previous video that those hormones can't actually go into the cells and make change. And what they have to do is they have to signal another chemical inside the cell to take over and pass on that message. So we're going to have a look at adrenaline, which is another hormone that we need to know about that does this as well, and look at these two and decide how they actually cause this secondary messenger cycle. So first things first is, why can't they cross the cell membrane? So some hormones are what we call non-steroid hormones, so they're not made of similar molecules to the cell membrane, they're made of proteins. And we should know by now that hopefully most proteins are too large, or they are unable to cross through that phospholipid bilayer because they're not lipid soluble. So remember, anything that is charged, so that includes polar molecules with the exception of water because it is small, and anything that is not lipid soluble or fat soluble means that it can't just diffuse through that plasma membrane, or if it's too large as well, obviously. So hormones, some hormones are non-steroid hormones, so they're protein based, and so they haven't got this ability to move through the cell membrane. This means they have to bind to a receptor on the outside of the cell membrane and rely on what we call secondary messengers to work inside the cells to amplify that original signal and cause the change to happen within the cell. So we're going to look at two hormones, glucagon and adrenaline. Obviously, we've seen glucagon and spoke about glucagon before, so it is being released by the alpha cells, which are in the islands of Langerhans, which are based in the pancreas. The other hormone we need to look at is adrenaline. So adrenaline is secreted by the adrenal glands, which are found on top of your kidney. So you have one gland on the top of each kidney, and they secrete the hormone adrenaline. You've probably come across adrenaline before, previously spoke about potentially at GCSE, looking at the fight or flight response, or looking at the fact that it can increase things like heart rate. But we're going to look at it today in the context of how it plays a role in our management of blood glucose levels. So we'll look at an example of one of these methods of adrenaline, which is the activation of the liver cells, and through this secondary messenger model that we've talked about. And this is how we release more glucose into the blood. So both adrenaline or glucagon can do this. They bind to their receptors on the cell membrane of liver cells. And these are classed as the first messengers. So non-steroid hormones, hormones that have to bind to receptors on the outside of cells, are classed as the first messenger. The adrenaline and glucagon have both been secreted as a response to low blood glucose levels in this case, and their aim is obviously to try and cause a change in the liver cells that's going to release glucose into the blood. So the first thing that happens when they bind to their receptors is that it triggers the activation of something called a G protein. So we're going to take the G protein and activate it. Normally, remember when we talk about activation, we tend to mean adding a phosphate group, which is something, one of those other uses of ATP, is to be able to add a phosphate group to a molecule, and it tends to activate it or increase its energy level. That activated G protein then causes a shape change in an enzyme that's bound inside the membrane called adenal cyclase. It's an enzyme, and so this conformational shape change that happens when the G protein binds to it makes it able to be activated. So it changes the shape in order for it to now accept its substrate and be able to catalyze a reaction. The adenal cyclase enzyme, when it's activated, can catalyze the conversion of ATP into something called cyclic AMP, or CAMP for short, and this is then the secondary messenger. So this activation of ATP into CAMP, the CAMP is what then goes on to cause the changes in the cell that we want to happen. So it's the secondary messenger. It passes on this signal and causes the change in the cell. So what CAMP does is it activates a protein kinase enzyme cascade. So protein kinase enzymes are a group of enzymes, and this idea of a cascade is that one enzyme is activated, which causes something to happen, which triggers another enzyme, etc. And ultimately, this leads to the breakdown of glycogen into glucose, or glycogenolysis. And so therefore, we're going to release glucose into the bloodstream. So that binding of the adrenaline or the glucagon through this system has triggered a change in the cell, which has resulted in the outcome that we wanted, as the effector causes the response of increasing the blood glucose level. So this is a very similar system used by a lot of hormones that have to bind to receptors. It's similar, depending on obviously the target cell, it will have different effects based on what this enzyme cascade sets off. But this is something that's quite common in cells and biology as a way of triggering an effect inside a cell from the outside by only being able to bind to a receptor. This 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 points is the kind of thing you might need to write and say a long answer question describing how a secondary messenger might cause a change in a cell. Or, for example, if it asks how adrenaline or glucagon actually leads to liver cells producing more glucose or releasing glucose, this is the type of thing you would say.
Ouch! This is why in some videos I explain scratches.